He is also a frequent contributor to many of the libertarian periodicals. His subject is going to be urban economics for the libertarian. And he asked me to announce that that talk will cover additionally the subjects of courts and police. Mr. Block.
One good thing about urban economics, and the reason I found myself in urban economics, is because there's scarcely anything that's not in urban economics. So you can get to talk about whatever you want to. And I will include a discussion of a very famous passage in Ayn Rand's Virtue of Selfishness on what happens when Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith have a face-off. Because court systems and police problems are urban problems, as is everything else. Okay, it seems to me that the basic problem, or the basic dichotomy that we face, is the one between centralism and decentralism. The one between tribalism and individualism, if you will. The one between state socialism or state capitalism and the free market. Now, the problem with the centralism, I don't think I have to go into here. The case has been made. We've had murder, rape, and killing on a mass level due to centralism getting out of hand. So very often people turn to decentralism. Decentralism is the answer. Decentralism allows each guy to do his own thing, so that's very good. But one thing that the leftist decentralists don't realize is that if we just had decentralism, with no way to coordinate each guy doing his own thing, we'd have chaos. Not anarchy, by the way, chaos. And what we as free market advocates know is that there are two ways, really one way, the price system and the property rights system, that allow us to coordinate each individual's doing his own thing. For instance, if everybody wanted to be a concert pianist, everyone wanted to do his own thing that way, the centralism's answer would be, you get Big Brother or Uncle Sam or whoever is in charge, and he arbitrarily says, well, you can't be a pianist because we need you in the salt mines, or what have you. The decentralist answer is one much more consistent with freedom, and that is that the price or the return of concert pianists goes way, way down, and the price or the wage of the people that have to shovel the shit in society goes way, way up. And in that way, we induce people to shovel society's shit. And this system, very much importantly, depends upon there being a price system and a property rights system. If we do not have property rights, and if we do not have this price mechanism working, then it cannot perform the coordinative function. Now, I stress the coordinative function as opposed to what some right-wing libertarians sometimes do is they use private property rights as an excuse for the status quo. They pretty much say that any property right title that exists is legal. People have even gone so far as to say that slavery was legal because, after all, you had the bill of sale for the slaves. I'm not doing that. I'm assuming that the price system and the property right system are acting as coordinators. Now, let's take an interesting case. Professor Rothbard touched on externalities or neighborhood effects yesterday. Let's take the case of the drive-in movies. Suppose that the state refused to allow drive-in movies to erect large fences outside of them. Then we would have, it seems to me, a case of an externality. Now, there are several terms that are all synonymous: externality, neighborhood effects, public goods. The important distinction would be between an external economy and an external diseconomy. And the definitions of these, the external economy would be that A helps B, but A cannot charge B for the help. In other words, in the case of the miniskirts, the girls provide a service or benefit for the guys, and they cannot charge them for it. So that's an external economy. The external diseconomy, which is a very different type of thing, A hurts B, and B cannot collect from A. And this is, we get into the pollution problems and other problems like that. Now, there's a curious argument that Professor Rothbard went over last time, and this is that if all externalities are not internalized, namely, if we do not get rid of externalities, we will have some imperfections. Therefore, people like Friedman would say, we have to let the state step in. Let me just read a little bit from Capitalism and Freedom, where Friedman shows that he is a little weak on this economic question. This is the problem of neighborhood effects. An obvious example is the pollution of a stream. I'm on page 30. The man who pollutes a stream is in effect forcing others to exchange good water for bad. These others might be willing to make the exchange at a price, but it is not feasible for them acting individually to avoid the exchange or enforce appropriate compensation. A less obvious example is the provision of highways. In this case, it is technically possible to identify and hence charge individuals for the use of the roads, and so to have private operation. However, for general access roads involving many points of entry and exit, the costs of collection would be extremely high if a charge would be made for the specific services received by each individual. Parks are an interesting example, Friedman says. For the city park, it is extremely difficult to identify the people who benefit from it and to charge them for the benefits which they receive. So what pretty much Friedman is doing is saying that in cases of externalities, because we have certain inefficiencies, namely we do not have perfect efficiency, the government has to step in. Now, this argument is one of the key arguments against the free market, the idea that it is not perfect. And free market advocates usually have two rebuttals. One is that the state caused it in the first place. And that's true in this case, as I'll try to illustrate. The other is that just because something is imperfect, it does not follow that the government should do it. Economists take great pride in drawing all these spaghetti-looking diagrams and charts and stuff, and at the end we conclude that the market is imperfect. Well, it is imperfect. Anything made up of people that are on this side of the Garden of Eden will have to be imperfect. But just because it's imperfect, it does not follow that other imperfect people, government people, who might even have greater imperfections, should do anything about it. Now, let's get back to this case of the drive-in movies being forbidden to erect a large fence around. In this case, if they were forbidden to have a large fence around their drive-in movies, what would happen? Would we be allowed, or would the decentralist system be able to provide drive-in movies? No, or at least to a great extent, because the benefits would spill over. In other words, we would not be able to internalize the benefits, namely to make those people who benefit pay for it. There would be a great spillover, and the decentralist system could not provide any drive-in movies, or at least it would do it with much less efficiency. Take the case of private parks in the city. Friedman would say we cannot allow the market to do it because the market will not do it. The state has to step in. Now, this case is used in many other areas. Beside the city park, there's also the fire department. It's been alleged that the state has to run the firehouses because, consider this following case. Suppose there are a whole bunch of houses all in a row, 1 through 5. If we allowed each individual to have a fire contract or to not have a fire contract, think of the guy in the middle, say in house 3. If the people on either side of him did not have a fire contract, he might be stuck. So the idea is that fire protection is a public good, the free market cannot do it, etc. Also, the lighthouse case is another one. Buckley has attacked Professor Rothbard on the evils of lighthouses. But the lighthouse case is a key question. Buckley said, where is it? My all-time favorite is Mr. Rothbard's proposal that the lighthouses that throw out their welcome to storm-tossed ships should be privately owned. The lighthouse keeper zooming out to collect $1 from any ship who can be proved to have treated itself to a bearing drawn from the private stock of the owner's electricity. Now, you may judge that Rothbard is totally humorless. Believe me, he is not. Having known him, I give you that as an instructed verdict. It is merely that he is a fundamentalist who begins with the assumption that the state is evil and marches on to the conclusion that all uses of the state are accordingly evil. Namely, Buckley is attacking consistency, it would seem. Perhaps the most important case of this externality thing is defense. It's often alleged that the enemy will take over, and it's usually a communist enemy speaking Chinese or Russian. Very few people realize that the enemy already has taken over and he's sitting in the White House. But we can treat this argument on its own level and assume that the enemy is external, and how would we defend against the external enemy? And the idea is that if I put a rocket ship, and let's assume for the sake of argument that a rocket ship will be used defensively so we don't get into that hassle. If I put a rocket ship near my place and I protect my property, I'll also be defending your property. So there's an external benefit spilling over. So therefore the market can't do it, which means we can't have it done in a decentralist way. That means Uncle Sam or Big Brother or the centralist way has to do it. Okay, let me see if I can't elucidate or make my case that the government has caused all these problems in the first place. Now, take the lighthouses, for instance. That's a key favorite, as I said. The reason that no one will provide lights, that private entrepreneurs will not provide lights, is because they won't be paid for it. They won't be paid for it because they do not own the oceans. Now, ownership of the oceans is a very important question. Right now, the oceans are going to become a very important resource, and if we allow this argument to pass, then it'll be the state that'll be running the water, and with all these natural resources. The idea is that private enterprise can't do the job. I would want to suggest that private enterprise wouldn't be able to provide lights for roads either, because if private enterprise doesn't own the roads, then why should they provide the lights? I would also want to suggest that even in a grocery store, if you did not allow the grocer to own the grocery store, he wouldn't provide lights either. So the answer, it seems to me, is to stop this restriction of private property rights or legitimate property rights, and to allow the oceans to be owned. And then if the ocean were owned or the roads were owned by private individuals, the person that did not put good lights in there would soon lose customers, and he would be forced to go out of business. Now, the thing with the fire department, this idea that houses are all in a row, and the guy in the middle house won't be able to buy a house free of security, overlooks another case where the market can internalize externalities and would internalize externalities, namely get rid of this externality problem, if there were no fire department providing the services for free. For instance, suppose you were on the outset of buying house number 3. Wouldn't you want to go over to the owner or the builder of all 5 houses and ask him what are the contractual arrangements of the houses on either side of your house? And if the builder of the house was so silly to say, well, there is none, well, then what do you think that house would be able to sell for? Very little, without the protection. So in this way, we would be able to see a way to take care of that middle house problem. That house wouldn't be sold unless the market provided protection. Otherwise we'd have some very foolish buying, which would tend to disappear. The case of the city park. See, we started, say, New York City with Central Park, so we didn't have that problem. But how would the market provide parks without the government aid or intervention or what have you? It seems to me that one way might be that you'd have something like a shopping center, only a shopping center of houses, a whole bunch of houses, and internal to that is the park. And in that way, you might not have the benefits spilling over, so that the thing would be amenable to the price system. In other words, if the park were gathered in the middle of these buildings, the park would be benefiting just those people in the buildings plus the people that paid for it. And in that way, the market could provide parks. You don't need the government to provide parks. But the point is that if they're giving it away for free downstairs or next door or what have you, there is no incentive for the market to provide these services. Take the case of defense. That's one of the roughest usually for free market advocates to talk about. The idea that if I defend myself, I'm also defending you, and if I can't get you to pay for it somehow involuntarily, I'm not going to do it myself, or I'll do it to a much less degree. The point here would be some sort of restrictive covenants. In other words, if there were a guy who started a city way back when, and he wanted to worry about this problem, he would say that what you're really doing when you buy this land is you buy a package deal. You buy the land plus you buy a defense contract. And if people like this, then his way of doing things would prosper. And if they didn't, then this would prove that there was no need, there was no problem in the first place. Okay, let me get on to a key question with courts and police. I want to suggest, I want to back up the speaker that spoke before me, that one of the greatest causes of crime is the drug addiction problem, and that's clearly a state-enforced problem because they outlaw the stuff in the first place. I also want to suggest that the problem of individual muggers is one that is a great problem nowadays, and you walk through Central Park or through Riverside Park at certain hours of the night, and you're not likely to get too far. One of the reasons for this is that we do not have any competing police forces. Imagine what would happen if Central Park were privately owned and some other park were privately owned, and one park owner treated his property in such a way that everyone who went there got mugged, and the other one didn't. Sooner or later, the forces of competition would force one owner out of business and the other owner into business. We'd have a natural survival of the most efficient entrepreneurs in that way. But in this case, who loses money when somebody gets mugged or the statistics go up? The statistics of crime go up in Central Park. No one. So we don't have this day-by-day dollar vote external control over the situation. But Ayn Rand says the following about competing police forces. Nor can one call it a floating abstraction, and this is from The Virtue of Selfishness, page 113, since it is devoid of any contact with or reference to reality and cannot be concretized at all, not even roughly or approximately. One illustration will be sufficient. Suppose Mr. Smith, a customer of Government A, suspects that his next-door neighbor, Mr. Jones, a customer of Government B, has robbed him. A squad of Police A proceeds to Mr. Jones's house and is met at the door by a squad of Police B, who declare that they do not accept the validity of Mr. Smith's complaint and do not recognize the authority of Government A. What happens then? You take it from there. Now, I want to suggest that the free market has a way out of this, and that any other alternative beside the free market way of handling this very important service for people would be less efficient. In other words, yesterday during the debate between Mr. Childs and Mr. St. John, they were talking about the morality of anarchy. And Mr. Childs, I think very correctly, was saying that if X is moral, it's moral for anyone to do it. And if it's immoral, it's not moral for anyone to do it. Today I want to talk more about the efficiency, to see how the thing could work. Okay, take Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones, and we're going to make one assumption, or we're going to divide the cases into two cases. In the first, we're going to assume that all courts and police forces are honest, in the sense that there is no bandit court. We're going to delegate that question to the next consideration. So in the first case, we assume that all courts and police are honest, in the sense that none of them are going to purposely violate people's rights, and they're all going to live according to this objective code based on property rights and non-aggression against non-aggressors. Okay, the assumption of Miss Rand would seem to me to be that these people would not be able to look ahead. In other words, the problem will come up and all of a sudden it's there and there's no forethought at all as to what might happen. But if people running police agencies and court agencies had evolved through a free market, this thing would have evolved into certain rules and procedures. Even if we started it right now, any rational people, and if you're going to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be somewhat rational, would plan ahead, would try to come up with some situation, some contract, some agreement, some way to arbitrate this question before it happens so that you don't send out your police forces and have them fight each other on, Mr. Jones's door or what have you. One way might be to have a Supreme Court. Namely, Court A and B agree in advance that in case of any altercation between them to come up later, they will arbitrate it with Supreme Court, Acme Supreme Court. Now, if this problem then came up, they would just refer to Acme Supreme Court, and then there'd be no problem of little people fighting all the time. You wouldn't have this idea that anarchy would be chaos all over the place. By the way, the etymological derivation of anarchy is just anarchy, where an means against. So to find out what anarchy means, it's just against archy. But what is archy? Statism, coercion, aggression against non-aggressors. So it's not quite fair to equate anarchy and chaos. That might be a claim, but I think it's an incorrect claim. The correct claim is that archy is chaos, or statism is chaos. Okay, let's suppose, though, that some people don't want to make these agreements. There are some people, and now they're not banded courts. They're not like, the mafia court or something, or I go to my mother and she says, oh, Walter was a nice boy, he didn't do anything. And I just say, Mar Block is the court. We'll get to that in a second. Right now we're assuming that they're all honest courts. And I'm trying to combat Miss Rand's allegation that you're going to have fighting in the streets every minute. By the way, before I forget, this whole rap on courts, as many of the other things I know now about, have come from Murray Rothbard, Professor Murray Rothbard, who has written about this in Power and Market. The first chapter of that is a brilliant short critique of the Randian view, and I'm very heavily leaning on that. So if you'd like to pursue the matter further, I can't recommend any book higher than that. Okay, now to get back to the honest courts. Suppose, though, that there are some courts that refuse to sign these contracts, and that whenever an altercation between them and another court comes up, they fight it out. Okay, so we have two types of courts. Those that will sign agreements for arbitration and those that won't. Now, the courts that will sign arbitration procedures with the Supreme Courts, when will they get into fights? Never. No, excuse me. They'll only get into fights with those courts that refuse to sign. Is that clear? The courts that will sign these contracts will only fight with, say, half the court population. Okay? But the courts that will not sign these contracts, they're going to fight with everyone. They're going to fight with people that didn't sign these contracts, and they're going to fight with people that did sign these contracts. So we're going to have the peaceful courts, fighting with half, or the people that are not peaceful, whereas the non-peaceful people will be fighting with everybody. Now, I take it as a matter of fact that fighting is very expensive. Fighting is prohibitively expensive. Only governments can afford it, not private enterprise. Because these courts that keep fighting with people that are peaceful and with other people are going to have higher cost curves in the parlance of economists. They're going to have higher costs. And economic theory would predict that if all things started out equal otherwise, that in the long run, these courts that kept fighting would lose business and not be able to stay in as courts. Moreover, we would predict that they wouldn't even start out that way if they had any sense enough to get the money to start a court in the first place. So I think that answers Ms. Rand's question of what happens then. You take it from there on that premise. that all the courts are honest. Now let's take the case of Ma Block's court, and whenever little Walter gets into trouble, he comes running to Mama, and he says, those bad boys, they're giving me hassles, and I want you to try the case. And Ma Block says, okay, we'll try the case, and guess who wins all the cases? Okay, this is the case of a bandit court, or a mafia court. Now, people might think that this is a final blow to the free market theory. Free market can't operate if we have bandit courts, and there's no reason why we won't have bandit courts. And that's right, there is no reason why we won't have bandit courts. People are people, and some of them are bandit-like. I mean, on this side of the Garden of Eden, people are imperfect. That's the way the world is, tough. What we have to do is try to find a way to deal with that. Now, I want to reject the usual liberal view that because it's imperfect, or because the market would be imperfect, therefore the government's got to do it. That I don't think follows. I think that would be the worst of all possible cases. Because who's in charge of the courts now? You got the biggest, fattest bandit of them all. Tricky Dick Nixon, High Commissioner of the Courts or whatever. See, the case is always one of centralism versus decentralism. Given that we have a problem and that nothing is going to be perfectly a perfect answer, how are we going to do it? Are we going to decentralize and try to have it on the lowest level possible, or are we going to try to centralize it and say that, we might have a few bandit courts and therefore we've got to have a big one? That's crazy. The point Professor Rothbard was trying to make yesterday with Mr. St. John, he asked what would be the logical size or the size of the objectivist court or government system. He was trying to imply that a system that implies limited government or a monopoly government also implies world government. Because we can make Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones into two countries, right? I could read this whole thing again, and this time, instead of government A and government B and Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones being part of the same government, as Ms. Rand is implying, let us assume that they're parts of different governments, and I want to prove to you that Ms. Rand is secretly a world government advocate. Must be a commie or something, I don't know. I'm kidding. I don't think she's a commie. But I think she's a world government advocate. Now let me read it again and see if you can't see that implication. One illustration would be sufficient. Suppose Mr. Smith, a customer of government A, by government now we mean a geographical government like France or something, suspects that his next door neighbor, Mr. Jones, a customer of government B, has robbed him. A squad of police A proceeds to Mr. Jones' house and is met at the door by a squad of police B, or A, or whatever it is, who declare that they do not accept the validity of Mr. Smith's complaint, and they do not recognize the authority of government A. What happens then? You take it from there. The implication is we need somebody above these little piddling free market defense agencies, because obviously you'll have chaos and anarchy if we have freedom, right? Well, if it applies to this domestic level, it also applies to the world level. What she is really advocating is world government. What she is advocating is that the problem of little fights among people, Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith are having a fight, what we have to do is have a big super Uncle Sam or a big brother to take care of it. Obviously, if we have a bandit court, what we do is we zap them to the best of our ability. It's very hard to zap Nixon, though. He's got all the guns. Now imagine if it was Mr. Nixon, the president of the world. Where would you go then, Miss Rand? To be consistent with your theory, where would you go then? Yeah. There's always a platform as long as the government doesn't mind you being on that platform. Okay. Okay, so let me reiterate this talk of mine based on externalities and public goods and the idea that Uncle Sam has to do it because the free market is imperfect. What I'm trying to say is that if we want decentralism, we have to tell our new left brethren, if we consider them that. Oh, and by the way, the previous speaker before me said that there was this debate between Abby Hoffman and who else was on the program? Philip Abbott Lewis. Well, I was rooting for the other guy. He was the one that had this American flag on him, and they blipped him out, if you'll remember that TV program. It seems to me another article, a brilliant article written by Professor Rothbard in Left and Right, indicates that if we really believe in private property, well, the flag is a piece of private property, is it not? Sure it is. Therefore, we can use it as a shirt or not. I mean, Abbie Hoffman was just exercising his rights of private property. And the other guy, the supposed libertarian, was against him for that. Can't see that one. So what I'm trying to say is that if we want to have a decentralist view, and we want to talk to the new left on decentralism, we have to tell them that the price system and the property system are the alternatives. That if we don't have the price system and the property system, then the only alternative is centralized planning. Uncle Sam or Big Brother tells us how to do it. The alternative to that is to allow a price system. Now what's wrong with Friedman is he is saying, Friedman on externalities here, is he is saying that if the thing does not work perfectly, therefore the government's got to do it. He doesn't realize that in many cases the government has stopped it up in the first place by not allowing private ownership of the waters, by not consistently applying the laws of trespass to pollution. Pollution is really nothing more than trespass. Instead of trespassing yourself or you let your cows go to the next guy's area, you're trespassing your dust particles. If they would consistently treat that like the invasion of property rights that it is, we would have that problem under solution. Okay, thank you.